it would be great if you could introduce yourself.
My name is Zain Habboo, and I am the Senior Director for Digital and Social Media Marketing at the UN Foundation.
Great. So how did you start? How did you get there?
I actually studied anthropology and photography, which everybody told me was a useless degree to have. Got my first job at National Geographic in 1999, where they were looking for young people to start a quote-unquote website. So I started building websites and happened to be in the digital media space when Facebook and Instagram and Twitter exploded onto the scene. And then 14 years later, decided to go back to my nonprofit and UN-related roots. So I moved over to the UN Foundation, where I work in the communications division, really trying to advance the UN's message using social media.
So, the Trump result happened. There's a lot of chaos probably in DC. How do you think, at least organizationally, if there's been a reframe in terms of the conversation that should be had now, because we live in slightly more turbulent times, I guess?
So to quote the UN's new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, I think less about who's elected president and more about being principled and how we can make it a constructive and a positive conversation. I think that we've seen globally that people have woken up. It's not just in the US where election results were a surprise. So we're seeing globally that I think citizens are beginning to take their world back in their hands. And I think that's a positive thing. Actually, it's a wake-up call for everybody, whether your issues are LGBTQ, whether it's UN reform, whether it's maternal and newborn healthcare. So I think what we are going to start to see is how we help the world globally, no matter which side of the aisle you sit on, tell your story about the issues that you care about using digital platforms in a positive fashion.
So we saw the emergence of fake news, right? In a big way. I think a bigger manifestation of that might be alternative sources of information being used to spread propaganda. Is that something that concerns you in the way you look at digital communication landscape?
Fake news is a huge concern. I would say not just for the UN Foundation, not just for the UN, but it should be for everybody in the media world today. I think it's why the UN Foundation houses the Global Bureau Initiative, which brings together media partners and creates media trainings around the world. I think more than ever, we need to start doing more and more media trainings. I think we need to start mentoring young journalists. You see the big publishing and media houses moving further and further away from old school reporting. There's a lack of copy editing. There's a lack of mentorship, a lack of quality assurance. And so hopefully through initiatives like the Global Bureau, we're trying to work with publications to fund development desks around the world and to do credible reporting.
So how do you think this coalition sort of that you're building informally and formally, is there an interest in the media to work together? Because sometimes they have different viewpoints. How do you build consensus for the mouthpiece, so to say?
By bringing a coalition together, by giving them different opportunities, especially unique one-on-one opportunities, for example, an off-the-record briefing with the Secretary General, by introducing them to different ways to tell the stories of the Sustainable Development Goals, of the UN, of the developing world, is how we find that we're able to get them to talk with substance and succinctly about the issues we care about. I just want to be clear. At no point do we dictate editorial. I think that's really important, and I think you actually have much better results when you cede control. I think part of the coalition we have is broken out by old school publications, then digital publications like Quartz, Mashable, etc. And then that third tier is who's coming next. Is it Snapchat Discover? What's going to be the next thing? And I think being able to work with 3 different types of media and ceding control while giving them the tools that they need is what helps us get that story out.
I think the UN Foundation has been particularly successful in building these organic word-of-mouth networks, which are really credible because they come from the ground up. How do you go about building that?
We look at the countries that we're working in. We look at where the SDGs are. We look at where progress needs to be made. And we go into those countries and we find influencers. And what we do is we create communities like the Plus Social Good community, like our Global Entrepreneurs Council, the Global Journalists Corps. And then, for example, even more grassroots is our Girl Up campaign that's for girls by girls, where we work with teenage girls around the world. And they're the ones who set the table for what the Girl Up campaign should be working on. So it really is based on where we believe the greatest need for work needs to be done. And then we find people in those communities. The next thing we do is we offer them opportunities that we hope others can't offer them. We bring them to Dubai for the World Government Summit. We're able to have them attend summits. We're able to have them interview ministers and kings and queens, and we're able to get them information that they wouldn't ordinarily have so that they can begin to talk to their networks about that and have a ripple effect happen.
I think influencer marketing is a proven strategy in the media landscape. I think, how do you think in the networks you build and in your efforts in building a digital-friendly, digital-forward media organization within the UNF and in your career in general, what do you think of the media landscape right now in the US, where you have very well-funded media companies such as Vox, BuzzFeed, Mashable, which aren't always working? They're struggling sometimes as a glut, so to say. In this landscape, how do you think, what's the way forward for these sort of organizations, just as a strategist?
My hope is that more people like Jeff Bezos invest in news. My hope is that we find today's Ted Turners to invest in news publications. I think that everybody's struggling, and massive news organizations are being bought by corporations, and it's becoming more and more about clicks and about tweets than it is about the actual news. And I understand that because everybody has to make a profit. And you can only have so many. Mike is one of my favorite new news pop-ups, and you can only have so many mics before Mike's going to get absorbed by somebody else. Again, I don't mean to sound old school, but I really think in a digital first world, it still comes down to news and it still comes down to credibility. And it's going to take those influencers and people who have the resources to invest in news to bring it back to where it needs to be. Otherwise, we're all going to be just speaking in sound bites for the rest of our lives.
Do you think there's a growing role that philanthropy needs to play in shaping news? Because if news isn't making money the way it used to and people aren't figuring it out, do you think that could be a place where, philanthropy now starts to play a bigger role?
I do. I think that organizations like the Knight Foundation are a really good example of people who give grants to media organizations. I think the Global Bureau, not to be self-promotional, coming out of a foundation gives grants to media organizations. I think to your point, though, when I think of philanthropists, I'm thinking again of the big names, the Ted Turners, the Jeff Bezoses, and then the ones who don't want to be mentioned. I think it would be interesting now more than ever with what's happening in the world from a leadership perspective and from a credibility perspective for these people to think about how they want their stories to be told and to invest their money in those publications. So the short answer is yes. I think we need to figure out a better way to do it than just small grants.
Moving a little bit away, how do you, in this stream of noise that's become our social feed, how do you build some sort of authenticity and uniqueness in your perspective or your voice when you share it with the world? Because it's as much about discovery as it is about, content right now.
The way that we do it at the UN Foundation goes back to a question you asked earlier about our organic networks that we create. I think having our Plus Social Good community and our Global Journalists community, our Instacore, which is a core of photographers who are Instagram only, who are covering the world behind the scenes for us. I think telling our stories and the UN stories using genuine voices who are in the space is the way that we break through the noise and the way that we maintain authenticity. We could sit and program tweets that go out every single hour and we could have great numbers, but I don't think we would have the engagement we have if we didn't have real people behind the scenes.
So going sort of behind the curtain, sort of say, what does it take to do what you do? What's the size of the team? It's not a one-woman army, right?
It takes a lot of faith from leadership at the foundation. It takes a CEO and president who believes that we should be digital first above all else and who understands that digital is not an afterthought or a redheaded stepchild. So from a dreaming perspective, that's what it takes. And we're really lucky at the UN Foundation. Kathy Calvin is 100% digital first, and whatever's next, she's going to be that first, which is amazing to have that faith. It takes having a team. People need to invest in resources. And we have a team of about 12 people who focus on digital and social media and marketing only. They don't all work just on the UNF brand. They work on the campaigns as well. Having community managers, having social media managers, having people who are focusing on Snapchat as well as everything else they're doing is what it takes to get us going. The biggest thing I would say, though, is to have no fear. I think the beauty of working in the digital space, and you understand this better than anyone, is the fact that you can try something, and if you fail, it's completely fine. Nobody judges you for it. Own up to it, move on, and then move on to the next channel.
I think one place where it's impressive is how quickly the UNF has been able to get into newer channels that emerge, Snapchat, Medium being recent additions. How do you remain agile with this scale and responsibility? Because the UN traditionally has been associated with, the pace of an elephant. So how do you remain agile in this digital first world?
There is something to be said for the fact that none of us do anything that's in our job description at the UN Foundation. We do our entire job description and then we add on. So I think agility comes from being willing to think outside of your job description. We want to launch a Snapchat account, we launch it. And whoever on the team wants to work on it, whoever raises their hand first is the person who's going to run our Snapchat account. The same goes for Medium, etc. So what you see instead of a group of people who go home every day at 5 o'clock is a group of people who are probably working till 7, 8, who are Snapchatting on the weekend for the foundation. Jenny Lee, who runs our Medium, is constantly thinking about, is this better than our blog? Is this where we need to be? Is this better than having a Huffington Post channel for our CEO, etc.? So I think agility just comes from being passionate about your work and being willing to step outside of your job description.
So going forward, any major disruptions or trends that you see in 2017, 2018?
I see movements, like global citizen movements, being a big trend that we're going to see. It's not something new. I think we've been spoiled for the US and the rest of the world. I would say we've been spoiled for the last 8 years. We haven't had to fight fights because somebody else was fighting them for us. So I think the biggest trend we're going to see in 2017 and 2018 at least is this idea of everybody taking back their fight and hopefully feeling passionate and bringing sort of purpose back into what they're doing every single day.
And sort of the last question, you're Jordanian, so you're from the region that we're currently in. We're in Dubai, broadly the MENA. I think this community has been through a lot historically, but also recently through various initiatives, bans, executive orders, whatnot. What do you think this region can do to leave a more positive footprint? How can it seize that influence in the vacuum that exists politically and internationally right now?
So I'll speak to Dubai first and the United Arab Emirates. What I have seen as a Jordanian being here is very different than where I come from. Here, they don't have baggage because they are a newer, emerging group of nations. And what I'm seeing that they're able to fill in that vacuum is this ability to want to move forward and think about the future. They don't have to constantly think about history and how to survive. What they think about is how do they thrive. And so I think the vacuum that they'll be able to fill here in the United Arab Emirates and hosting things like the World Government Summit and bringing the Elon Musks of the world and the Secretary Generals here is they're trying to balance this idea of governments and bureaucracy and disruption and technology. And they also have the funding here to be able to do that. So I think what they'll be able to do is use their ability to influence and to bring people together and then use their funding to hopefully find the gaps and fill those gaps with their funding. Here in the United Arab Emirates, at least from what I heard, they're looking farther than most of us are. They're less tied down with bureaucracy, even though it's called a World Government Summit. They're thinking about Mars and they're thinking about space and they're thinking about how we get there already when the rest of us, I feel, are chasing to find tomorrow. I think that this is quite actually innovative, what's happening here in Dubai. Being from a country like Jordan, where we don't have the resources that they have here necessarily, you have a lot of people who have the passion to get to these places, but are constantly struggling every day to find out how to keep ISIS and radical ideologies out of our country. So I think what you're going to see is hopefully the Gulf supporting neighboring countries to be able to bring them forward with them so that you don't have separate Middle Easts within the Middle East.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Sartaj.